So, okay. Uh, Allegedly race, rethinking the political history of early Mesopotamia. And before we start our talk, I think it may be necessary to familiarize with some very general chronological framework and the geography of Mesopotamia, the land that we are going to talk about. And we are about to enter into a time that is quite remote from us, at least on the surface, let's say. So we'll be starting approximately from 5,000 years BC, which is 7,000 years before now, before present, and we'll be ending somewhere around 2,400 BC, just before the dynasty of Akkad. Well, the dynasty of Akkad, we have reasons to believe it was the first recorded empire in history. Well, chronologically, it is remote from us, but we will soon find that at least in the eyes of the historian, this remote world is not perhaps very different from ours. And we find we can understand them if we try hard enough. Well, geographically, Mesopotamia, it is the great, well, to my knowledge, it was the Greek word for the land between the two rivers, right? The two rivers, which are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They flew through nowadays mainly Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and well, in ancient times, when we look at when we try to understand the history of it, we divide this land of Mesopotamia basically into two parts, northern part and the southern part. Well, the southern part is more or less the land of the modern state of Iraq. Sometimes we use the word Babylonia to refer to this region because, well, although Babylonia is again a later designation. In the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerians, they used the land of Sumer and Akkad to refer to this land that we know as Babylonia. Well, more or less, Babylonia starts from the Persian Gulf to the region that is close to nowadays Baghdad. Well, north to Baghdad, this is the part we call Northern Babylonia. Although our title says the early political history of Mesopotamia, well, more or less, I am going to talk about the southern part of it. This is the Uruk practice in our field, early Mesopotamian studies or archaeology, if you like. Well, we may remember that at least from this map, the Zagros, where is the Zagros mountain? Well, this will be of very important for our lecture. So please try to have a feeling of the geographical features of this piece of land. Well, immediately into our topic. For early Mesopotamia, our knowledge derives from texts as well as archaeology. And more often, although philologists are perhaps not very happy to listen to this kind of statement, the larger scale knowledge, historical knowledge, actually is often the contribution by archaeologists. Well, here I'm giving you a summary by an archaeologist who did research specifically on ethnicity in Mesopotamia. In his thesis dated 1995, Geoffrey Eberlin, he tried to figure out to prove that the archaeological and historical evidence suggests that some kind of meaningful social identity actually developed in the northern portion of southern Mesopotamia. Try to remember our geography, the Diyala region, the Zagros foothills southeast of Diyala, Susania plain, which is in nowadays Iran, and the surrounding areas of the Zagros Mountains during the Jemdet-Nasser period and early dynastic Wang periods, which is about 2,900 to 2,600 or 700 years BCE, very early on. Well, in the opinion of Dr. Ambling, the distribution and use of pottery styles is consistent in many ways with what we would expect an ethnic group marker. In the political context of state formation and the subsequent reduction in the control of southern Mesopotamian states over these regions, the ethnic character of this social identity is all the more likely. Well, I quote this not only because it expands perhaps better than my English, but also to show that at least for archaeologists as well as philologists, the study into ethnicity in early Mesopotamia has been always active. And at least in a few cases, as we have here, archaeologists are able to argue, however theoretically well nuanced, to argue that some kind of ethnic identity could be identified in larger Mesopotamia as early as almost 5,000 years ago. Well, this is the positive side of it. And another case is more recent by another archaeologist, Michael Rothman, professor. And he tried to argue in a paper published in PNAS. He tried to argue that the so-called Kura Araxes culture actually migrated southwards into different regions within the Near East. And in his opinion, this migratory group can be more or less considered an ethnic group. Well, with these two cases, we can, well, they didn't necessarily meet to identify that the ethnic group Dr. Ambling was talking about was actually the same ethnic group as Professor Rothman is talking about here. But the positive side of the study of ethnicity in early Mesopotamia is that we do have cases, well, at least for professional archaeologists, we do have cases to show that ethnicity can be a useful analytical concept to deal with early Mesopotamian history, if you like, from as early as more than 5,000 years ago, at least in larger Mesopotamia. Well, this is the positive side, as I said. But ethnicity is a concept that scholars have been using more recently. Well, before recent times, in early Mesopotamian studies, ethnicity has often been confused with that of race. Race is not a very friendly word these days, but here, as Dr. Ambling tried to give another summary of what kind of racial concepts have been actually applied to Mesopotamian studies or Asian Near Eastern studies in general, we may find all kinds of imaginable approaches with some racial concerns, racial tone, such as physical traits that differentiate Akkadians from Sumerians, and like shape of skull, sudden shape of nose, amount of hair on the body, etc. And well, this apparently as a trend of research now has faded away. Well, I want to, as an outsider, as well as as a researcher, I won't say I won't try to explain why the concept of race had been so popular in our modern times, and why all of a sudden it faded away as so to become so unfriendly an academic concept. But as Dr. Amberlin explains, he placed the word race in quotation marks because fixed boundaries among races hardly exist because of human integrity and because race itself is a cultural construct, and thus often is used in place of ethnic group, etc. Well, this is the more or less the standard answer, academic answer for the reason why we are no longer using the concept of race in historical research. Well, theoretically, we may go more nuanced in arguing why we give up race as an academic analytical tool. But one part of the argument against the use of race, a little bit beyond simply stating that race, we don't have hard evidence to argue for the true differences between races, or to argue for the usefulness of race, even as a cultural construct. One step further is that I think this is more important, that the concept of race or ethnicity, in fact, are often used as essentialist concepts, which means either race or ethnicity are taken to correspond to certain identifiable material characteristics of a group, any group of people, etc. Well, here, Dr. Amberlin is apparently critical of those even later uses, albeit essentialist uses of the concept of race or even ethnicity. He says, those who claim to identify a Semitic mentality with bibliography here, Sumerian religion, or to associate the distinctive social and political customs with these languages are assuming what they must demonstrate, the correspondence of these traits. Namely, Dr. Amberlin is demanding that these scholars who have been talking this and such and such as kind of any kind of umbrella concepts to prove that, for instance, the use of languages by a certain group corresponds to a certain political custom. He demands that scholars such as Professor Zhang have to prove, give evidence to prove this. We know from daily life that it is actually impossible to prove this, even in our own world. So Dr. Amberlin's criticism here, I would say, apparently he has reasons to say so. Essentialists' uses of the concept of race or ethnicity seem to have inherent problems. Well, not very much in defense of Professor Stankeller as one of the scholars being criticized here. Well, here I'm showing the book, as Dr. Emberlin quoted, two of the articles from here. One is by Professor Stankeller, another one by Professor Westenholz. Well, I'm more concerned with the topic apparently by Professor Stankeller on early political development. Well, in my opinion, not very much. In defense of Professor Stankeller, I want to point out before we come to the point that we have reasons to say Professor Stankeller does have some essentialist uses of the word of the understanding of the correspondence between languages and political formats, for instance. But there are also reasons to allow for a certain gray area here. We will come to the point later. Well, now let's look at start from Professor Stankeller's construction of the political development of early Mesopotamia. As you see here, with a very concise summary, the northern government, he divides Babylonia, southern Babylonia already, when he talks about early political development. The northern government, for which the most striking factor is the North seems never to have developed a system of independent city-states, even remotely comparable to that of the South. On the contrary, there is strong reason to believe that during the early dynastic 2 and 3 periods, northern Babylonia formed for most of the time a single territorial state whose gravity point usually remained at Kish. The qualification usually that was just applied to the role of Kish is necessary, but we know that political landscape of the north involved the two other major powers, Mali and Akshak, which actively competed with Kish for the major control of northern Babylonia. And if we can trust the testimony of the Sumerian king list, or at least 2 occasions, first Mali and then Akshak, well, actually achieved the ascendancy over Kish. This is familiar to those archaeologists, of course. Well, the reason why the North followed this particular path of development finds explanation in the distinctive character of its kingship, which was strong as the authoritarian and predominantly secular, as such as sharply contrasted with the southern kingship, which, as noted earlier, was generally weak and had an unmistakably religious character. Well, just to have, this is the background, this is the reason, why Dr. Emberlin was saying that Professor Stankeller was kind of essentialist, and northern, which is the Akkadian, and southern, which is the Sumerian, with different political formats. But here, I picked up the concluding paragraph from Professor Stankeller's 1993 article. His purpose, I would say, was actually to explain, to make a point that what we say this first recorded empire in history, the Sargonic Empire, was less of an innovation than one might conclude based on the study of Sargonic sources alone. He was basically saying before the Sargonic Empire, there was something very similar that was during the as early as the early dynastic 2 period. Something very similar was already taking place with the central point at Kish. Well, this was the central thesis. Well, if we try to understand from this angle, perhaps we can understand why Professor Stankeller tries to make things so simple, to simplify things, so to look more essentialist as necessary. This is my understanding of the debate, which means there are always gray areas where we may find divides between among scholarly opinions are not always that clear cut. So for us as interested students of early Mesopotamian history, the best way to do is to look at the materials, look at the historical development itself, to see how we should understand this process and how the concepts of race or ethnicity, how they actually played a role in the process. Well, here we have this map just to remind those who are already familiar with Mesopotamia of some basic facts. During the earliest historical, I would say historical periods, because we have already written what we call archaic Uruk, and this is the map of Babylonia. We have texts mentioning several Babylonian cities already. And during this time, there is, in scholarly literature, there was a theory called the Uruk world system, which basically says the southern city, by this time already was inhabited by a population perhaps as large as 50,000. Compared to our mega cities, this today is nothing, but 5,000 years ago, it was definitely the biggest city in the world, and it was a true city. In my opinion, it was very likely a commercial hub, a commercial center, which developed a system to reach out to faraway lands for natural resources. And this was most likely the background of the so-called Uruk world system. Well, within the city of Uruk, scholars like to talk about political system that is labeled as that of the priest king. Well, many books are still talking about the priest king. Well, in a very recent paper, I tried to argue that as early as this time, Uruk was more likely governed by an oligarchy of sorts, not very much a king, neither a priest. Well, here I won't go into more details, but here is the most important evidence for those who believe in the existence of a Uruk priest king. And what I want to say is that just try to look at how small was the kingly figure, and how, if you were going to reconstruct the kingly figure here with a quotation mark, how big of a human being you would reconstruct. So believe it or not, in my opinion, the city of Uruk at this time was not very different from other cities like Ashur in northern Mesopotamia, which was known as governed by an oligarchy, as literally. So there was a book written by an archaeologist entitled "Democracy Before Democracy." Actually, it was actually an oligarchic system. Well, this is as much as we can know of the internal governing of the city. On the regional level, besides the acknowledgement of a possible Uruk world system that goes as far as Turkey, as far as Lebanon, perhaps, at least Syria, Within Babylonia, we have also evidence from archaic Uruk for a regional cooperational scheme, if we like to call it. According to Professor Stankler again, this was, he called it a kind of inana amphictyoni. Well, here is the main evidence to argue for the existence of such a cultic league, cultic cooperational system. This is what we call the archaic city seal. We know from both Uruk and the northern cities, like northern sites like Jemdanasa and Urum and Teokaya. So it proves that there was some sort of intercity, supracity scheme, but more likely only cultic, because the amounts of goods recorded on the tablets, in the text inscribed on the tablets with such seals are often very small amounts of goods, economically insignificant. So Professor Stankler understood it as for cultic purposes. But however, we have this general image of Babylonia or southern Mesopotamia cities related to each other, known to each other, related to each other through some sort of, perhaps not very strong, some sort of weak connections. Well, at the same time, Uruk, at least we know Uruk as an economic power, was reaching out to faraway lands still at this time for natural resources, perhaps, and more or likely. But it seems, at least as the evidence shows, it seems that the situation soon changed, because 200 or 300 years later, when we come to historically, we call the archaic Ur period, we see archaeologically different things. We can identify first at the northern side of Kish, which is not very far from Baghdad. We find the first clearly identifiable palace, well, for secular kingship. This is an image taken in 1926. Well, this is more strikingly, very recently, Professor Stankler published again what he calls the plague of Kish, with obviously kingly figures and a gazetteer of place names or places. In Professor Stankler's opinion, all the places that were under control by the king's kingdom or even empire during this time. Well, anyway, the essential part is that by then, in our historical terminology, by the early dynastic II period, there was a secular kingship active in Kish. But at the same time, although chronologically slightly later, at the same time, we have the famous royal cemetery to the south, in deep south, though, at Ur. Well, here we find this is the very well-known standard of Ur. We have the drinking scene, we have the war, the battle scene, and we have reasons to believe that there was a secular, well, not so secular perhaps, but at least a full-blown kingship already in place also in Ur. Well, this is the background in which to understand Professor Stankler's theory of the north versus the south. On this map, we find where is Kish and where is Ur. And not accidentally, we have from these two sides the most the clearest evidence for the existence of kingship. And the Sumerian word for king, Luga, was actually known not the earliest, not in Kish, but from Ur. So the question is apparently how to understand this seemingly parallel development of kingship. Well, either more secular or less, but some kind of parallel development of a northern kingship and a southern kingship. Well, for me, very recently, I am just trying to do some research into another group of textual findings from again slightly later, from what I call Central Babylonia, with the focal point at Fara, ancient city of Uruk. Well, here we find, besides administrative texts, secular administrative texts, we find most strikingly plenty of mythic texts and lexical texts. This is the famous professional text lists. And besides the administrative texts and the mythic texts, many of the myths we have we know from later sources as well. But besides this text, we find a different system of writing. It was evidently Sumerian, the same as the other mythic texts, but it was written with a different system, with a system of replacements. For instance, the Sumerian god Binge Enlil was written with the three characters Ud, Ga, and Nun. It's well, my friend Dr. Zhang, he did research on this, but unfortunately he didn't publish in full his great dissertation yet. Here I beg his pardon to quote a bit from his unpublished work, just to show how the system works. Dr. Zhang doesn't believe that this was a system of cryptography, which means a system to deliver some ultra mystical meaning. Well, in my opinion, I'm slightly of a different opinion that I do believe this cryptography tries to do something other than the standard orthography. Well, also from Dr. Zhang's hard work, here I try to show that apparently the writing in this cryptography of the divine name Enlil is not random. It's not simply, you replace one original sign with someone that is possible from a repertoire of replacements. This is one of the reasons I believe it was a cryptography. Well, to cut it short, the question is, what was really happening? What was actually happening in the ancient city of Uruk at this particular moment, when Asian scholars were working hard, writing down mythic works, not only in the standard Sumerian orthography, but also in cryptography. Well, when we look at the administrative texts, we see different cities from afar. They were joining together for apparently some even military purposes. So what was going on here? This has been a classical question. Well, I'm jumping. I'm going. This is a classical question in early Mesopotamian studies, but unfortunately, to this day, there is no satisfactory answer to it. Well, here I go back to Dr. Amberlin's summary again. I thank him for his very capable summaries. One thing that is after many years of research, almost 100 years of research, we now have reasons to believe, at least for some scholars, that these texts, all of those texts that we find, more or less, we can say that they cover a period, their production at least, cover a period as short as 3 years, perhaps not as short, so short, but we have reasons, but not more than one generation's time, let's say. Therefore, the texts altogether, they do not themselves suggest a long-lived super-city organization. This is how much we can say. Well, Uruk, Adab, Nippur, Lagash, Shrupak, Umma, and Kesh, these cities, well, they were working together also for military purposes. We know it is not a long-lived super-city organization. This is the scholarly consensus, if we have any, to say about this group of materials. But is it enough? Because in my apparently we don't know the nature of this organization yet. So when we go back to the great Jacobson, we may remember his thesis, his fantastic idea of the Kiengi League. Well, the Shurupak texts were also the major evidence for his Kiengi League. I won't repeat what is here because for the sake of time, I'm taking too much time already. And for him, these troops from Uruk, Adab, Nippur, these cities, and since the order of the listing is the same in both texts, the text we just saw, headed by Uruk, well, Professor Jacobson believed that Uruk was perhaps still the head of the league. Well, the meeting point, according to Jacobson, was at Nippur, although the text we find, the provenance, the place we find the text is Shurupak. Well, we can see Professor Jacobson and Stankler, they share in common. They try to put this Shurupak tradition, or what I say, Central Babylonian tradition, either in closer connection with the Northern tradition, which was Kish, or closer with the Southern tradition, which was Uruk. It's difficult to go into more details, especially to explain. I'm sorry, I'm incapable to do this, but I think it's perhaps enough just to say that currently scholars either try to contextualize this what I call Shurupak tradition, Shurupak text, either with the southern tradition, which was Uruk, which was or the northern tradition, which was Kish. But based on my recent research, my understanding is that I think we have enough reasons to believe that these cities underlined on this map, Shurupak, Nippur, Adab, Umma, Lagash, perhaps Larsa, Uruk, they were forming a tradition that we may call the Central Babylonian tradition. And to say it boldly, it was the writing, the use of the cryptography had most likely a purpose to forge an identity. I won't say it was an ethnic identity, but I will say it was a political, religious identity. Behind this, there was most likely a theocracy going on. This is what I tried to say in my recent paper. Well, whatever. I think my job is almost done. So we go back to Barth, in his classical study, we often quote as for the definition of ethnicity. He says that categorical ascription is an ethnic ascription when it classifies a person in terms of his basic and most general identity, presumptively determined by his origin and background. Well, for ethnic identity, for ethnicity, as Dr. Emberling actually followed Barth's definition, I have not much to say. What I want to add is, for the study of early Mesopotamian history, even without a hard, clearly defined as concept of ethnicity for ethnic identity, we can in fact use in a parallel sense to use this approach to understand the borderland as the place of the region that is most likely to produce new identities. In my case, or in the Central Babylonian case, I believe it was the formation of a theocratic political religious identity, group identity. Well, the most important element that we must remember is that all identities, ethnic identities, perhaps more typically, we cannot understand in isolation from other groups, since all groups, identifiable groups, must be in contact with one another, and they must regard each other as culturally distinct from themselves. I think this is our current understanding of identity, including ethnic identity, and this is the non-essentialist use of race or ethnicity in the study of early Mesopotamia. Thank you to all the audience. I hope I've tried successfully to at least to say what I wanted to say, but I'm not very confident how much you get me. Whatever. Thank you very much. I hope, however, you get a sense of how we deal with early Mesopotamian history and what are the most critical research questions we are still struggling with. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm in. Am I? Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. I can't see Dr. Wang yet. Donnie? Oh yes, there you are. There you are. Thank you. I'll let you have a few words. I have myself one or two questions, but beforehand, would you like Donnie to present? Hello, can you hear me? I think Donnie. Yes. Okay, cool. So I'll let you, Donnie, do you the honor. I have myself a few questions, but please, Dr. Wang.
Thank you. I have about 10 minutes, right? That's what I was told.
Sure.
Okay, good. And unfortunately, I don't have any visual material, so I guess people will be looking at my face the whole time. I want to start by saying that I really, truly feel very privileged to be part of this conference, not least as the discussant of the first keynote lecture. I remember during my years in classics, I've always heard people say that we know really too little about other important civilizations outside of the Greco-Roman world. And I think listening to Professor Wang's presentation really confirmed this to me once again in a very vivid fashion, that how little I know about Mesopotamia, which actually had very important bearings on the Hellenic world that I study. So shame on me. And I think it's for this very reason that the chance to find out about how common themes played out in very different contexts is what makes this conference so valuable, especially to me, who has moved more and more in the direction of world history in recent years. So thank you again, Dr. Wang, and also to the conference organizers for including me. So now I want to make some brief comments on Professor Wang's presentation, which is pointing us to the conclusion, and do correct me if I didn't understand well, that the conclusion that an essentialist concept of race and a static notion of ethnicity in isolation, and along with that in the background, somewhat embedded a model of history developing from one stage to next, are being contradicted by evidence from early Mesopotamia. In fact, the findings urge us to bracket the conventional markers of race and ethnicity that we're familiar with, and to consider instead of an emergent group identity being forged by the religious and political elements in Babylonia. So thank you so much again, Dr. Wang, for sharing with us these findings. So this, I think, very thoughtful answer on the question of race from early Mesopotamia really complicates the question itself, or I would say on some level, it almost even negates the question itself. But I think it is precisely one of those messy results or instances where we find out that something actually does not apply so neatly that pivot us toward new directions and inquiries. Moreover, I think the great value in this presentation is to highlight once again that we're indeed not trapped by the current construction of race, and that there exist concretely other possibilities to help us imagine how to be ourselves and relate to others. So now I want to turn a little bit to Greco-Roman antiquity, which is my background. I would say the study of classics has encountered and engaged with the theme of race pretty much from the beginning. So without going through a complete list, I will just mention a couple examples that came to mind. And they include a discussion of the Dorian invasion, the idea that Rome fell due to racial mixing, the heated debate centered around the book Black Athena, the study of ethnicity and Hellenicity by Jonathan Hall, and most recently, outside of academia and in the popular sphere, though with enormous impact, the confrontation with appropriation of classics by those on the far right who embrace white supremacy. To me personally, these discussions are very meaningful, and I think they inject a lot of energy into the study of the ancient world. Now, I do not want to get into more detail because this is the job of the next panel, where you'll be hearing from people who are way more qualified than I am to speak on this. So I want to return to my own work and share a few thoughts on how race has figured in my own research. Now, I happen to be very political in my academic outlook, and sometimes one might say I'm even radical. Therefore, throughout my student years, I was really influenced by and personally paid a lot of attention to the discussion of race, gender, and class, which was really unfolding around me. My specific area of interest is the ancient Greek economy. So when I was developing my research, which eventually culminated into dissertation in a book, I was determined to take into account aspects of race and ethnicity. In the conceptual model I use for analyzing ancient Greek society, I use the word identity, or sometimes subjectivity, to encompass the perspectives of race and ethnicity. Again, I also do not want to get too much into my own project, although I can talk about it for days, but I think here is not the place for this. I would just say that overall, my work also confirms the enormous contested and fluid nature of identity/subjectivity in ancient Greece. And I do this by identifying large bodies of discursive systems. One of them is based on religion, which has an ecumenical foundation that transcends ascriptive categories to which race belongs. And the other is the well-delineated, geographically constricted discourse of the polis, which turns identity into a function of political action and hence making it self-formative, but also at the same time making the opposite turn by basing it on parentage. The last is an economic discourse of the market, where identity markers are being challenged, or I would say diminished, by forces that actively seek to replace diversity with utility. So it is with these three large frameworks and their interactions that I try to situate the question of race and identity in ancient Greece. Now I want to end my response by making an observation and also an exhortation. I've noticed that there's a tendency for ancient history to be somewhat residing on the passive end of these questions. What I mean by this is that, let's take example of race. Understanding of race, intellectual discourse, I think by large got elaborated by other modern specialists who clearly were responding to current events. And this helped the term to acquire currency and to kind of sort of trickle up into our own specialized fields. And then we subsequently ask the question if these concepts are appropriate ways of analysis and how well they apply. But I think we need to do better than that. We should not just be there to be mere recipients of other people's theoretical formulations. In fact, I'm perhaps a bit old-fashioned in wanting to see the ancient history being at the center of theoretical development also, because I believe it should really be guiding the studies of modernity, not the other way around. So in other words, we should also perhaps actively respond to current affairs and make the effort to develop our own unique theoretical and conceptual tools, ones that we can use to frame questions and discussions. And this conscious effort to help develop models and apparatus from ancient societies with a view to its wide applicability and relatability to the current moment will take our contribution of important discussions like that of race, gender, and class to the next level. I have attempted to do this in my study of the ancient economy, although I'm keenly aware of my limitations and lackings as a scholar. And it's my sincere wish that more will be joining me and Professor Wang in this effort together. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Thank you very much. We have here, so I know time is ticking, we have here a few questions, if I may. Yes? Hello, can you see me? Oh, okay, so Wang, Professor Wang Xianghua, you had a question here from Denise Makoski.
I'm replying questions already.
Right, but for us to enjoy that response, please,
Yeah.
because I think it's something that's quite important to point out. She was asking if we could see the evidence where the notions of race / ethnicity in ancient Mesopotamia were used to reinforce class distinctions, or the line between free and enslaved persons. Mm-hmm. So could you please tell us more about this?
This is a debated issue. On one side, we do have evidence from which we see some correspondence between class distinction, especially slavery, with the foreigners, let's say, in the earliest texts already. But it seems on the other side, the correspondence is not strong enough to say that a ethnic identity and class this identity fall together. They are two different things. They don't match that perfectly. Well, in different historical periods, the situation could be also different. Well, nowadays the debate is mostly on the earliest period, because evidence comes surprisingly from that period of time. I would recommend a paper written by the late Professor Englund from UCLA on the on the cage. I can give the bibliographical reference later.
Thank you. Perhaps Denise, can you hear us? Would you like to follow up on this?
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, we can. We can.
No, I really appreciate the sort of the complexity of the topic. And I think it's really interesting because I think people want to use race given our modern experiences of slavery, but I think it's important to understand the complexity of it when we apply it to the ancient world. So there's a lot of discussions of the intersections of race and slavery in both the Greek and Roman worlds, and the Greek and Roman worlds are also different in the way they handle slavery. So I'm just very interested in seeing how scholars in particular are kind of mapping some of those connections. So thank you very much, Professor Wang.
Thank you. Well, not surprisingly, there's quite much literature on this issue. In my impression, it's just the class distinction and ethnic identity. They don't match that well. This is my impression. Thank you, Denise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Professor. I have here a question from Benjamin Rosenblatt. Perhaps you've read it already. Should I read it out loud for all?
I think the last following up question from Benjamin is more interesting. Benjamin, if allowed, I will read your question. Can I? Yeah.
Please do.
Benjamin says, I found your conclusion regarding theocratic factors to be very interesting. In my research on Mesopotamia, I found that Sumerians and Akkadian leaders seem to have understood very early on that their actions can be justified through the will of the gods, stating that everything being done for the city is a message from the gods. This way, they could gather the support of the city for questionable or large-scale projects. Maybe this is why a theocracy forms. If I get Benjamin, if I get you correct, I think yeah, this is more or less or where we call theocracy. But my question is perhaps more to do with identifying the first recorded theocracy in history, if I can say so. Well, we can discuss this more later. At the moment, I can't, well, it is for this particular question, it's still an ongoing research project. It is a little bit early that I spell out. I need to prove it better still. But yes, I think theocracy as a political form was likely already in place in Mesopotamia as early as the 3rd millennium. Well, this may be too bold for my professional colleagues, but this is where I am trying to go into to argue for. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Perhaps we can have something from Benjamin Rosenblatt himself now. The response, yes. Benjamin, are you there? Can you hear us?
Unmute. All
yeah,
right.
Okay. Yes. You.
I think you guys can hear me now.
With us. Yeah, with us.
Okay,
Welcome.
great.
Welcome.
Yeah. So I've done a little bit of research on Mesopotamia myself and found the interaction between leaders and theology very interesting and power oriented. And so I'm guessing I'm trying to understand exactly what your research is adding to that in frame of, trying to frame race within that whole situation.
Yeah. Yeah, Benjamin, I wouldn't call my performance today perfect. I think I didn't explain clear enough what I wanted to explain, or because it was too complicated academic question. But hopefully I will publish a couple of papers on this. So if you are interested, you may try to follow up a bit. I think this is.
Yeah, certainly.
I have something related, if I may. I'm just double check there isn't any more questions. Yes. If I understand well, you talked a lot about this shared idea of kingship.
Mm-hmm.
If you could, I didn't quite understand how this shared idea of kingship is telling us so much about the notion of ethnicity and race.
Mm-hmm.
If you could expand a little bit, please.
I see. Okay, this is the important. Basically, it's how relevant our concern with ethnic identity is related to the study of kingship, for instance. So to say it again, I would say previous research, if there is something not very encouraging about it, is that either essentialist or not, previous research tried to essentialize a northern tradition versus a southern tradition of kingship. Well, they within this scheme, already in Jacobson, but also in Professor Stankeller's study, within this system, within this north-south, this bipolar reconstruction of for the development of Babylonian history, less attention was paid to the central part of the plain. Well, for a period long enough, at least as far as we know, for a period long enough, perhaps 200 or 300 years, 2 or 3 centuries at least, this was the borderland in between the south and the north. Well, this within this, if we see this central Babylonia as the borderline, with this recognition, it opens the possibility that we look at it as the field, as the region that is capable, that is likely to develop a type of identity that is similar to ethnic identity even. Although in my case, it was a more political identity, likely a religious political identity. Well, this is the relevance of it. It's a switch of perspective. If we try to use the concept of ethnic identity in a broader sense to look at early Mesopotamian history, we may it's less likely that we will miss the important factor, the important phenomena that was taking place in central Babylonia, historically a borderland.
Yeah.
Still not very clear, but I think this is how I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
No, it is clear enough for us. I wanted to add, if I may, because I know time is ticking. Like Dr. Wang was saying earlier, I wrote this down. Should modern theorists be starting with the arguments of you and your colleagues to understand our modern world? Yes, no pressure. It's kind of a heavy question.
Is this question for me or?
Yes, for you,
for
and also, you know, linking with what Dr. Wang was saying earlier.
So repeat the question again.
Okay, we were wondering if modern theorists today should first start with your proposition, your argument, as in Dr. Wang, before giving or before theorizing about our modern world today, thinking about your theories first, yours and Dr. Wang.
Well, if I understand correctly, well, as a researcher, I would say we first test our conception of ethnicity and, well, race or whatever. We actually first test such concepts in our research, especially in historical research, before we use it to understand the current world. But the current world outside academia doesn't work this way. It's perhaps the opposite. So for researchers, for scholars, and the general public, it is kind of a dialogue to deepen our understanding of ethnic identity or all kinds of identity. This is, am I to the point?
Yes, I hope so. I was hoping also that Dr. Wang could dip in, perhaps.
Yeah, Donnie.
If I need to, yes, Donnie, yes, welcome back.
Yeah, I think I made it very clear. I do want to extend the invitation for everyone here to kind of sort of address what I see is I find it to be, that's a generalization, right? I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like there's a tendency for study of ancient history to be rather passive when it comes to coming up with theoretical models. We're more eager to kind of figure out what models that have been used for other people, and then we're kind of confronted with them, and then we realize, okay, we should see whether this applies or not. Yeah, I personally would completely like to see it the other way around, because I think our fields are so rich for models and theories, and we need to at least compete on an equal level with modernists. If not, say, okay, we got to be the center and only we can come up with theory. That's maybe a little bit too unfair, but I think we need to take more of an active role in doing that, because otherwise we would also always just be answering questions that are, I find, somewhat posed and framed by others, you know, and they're not, may or may not be really, you know, useful for inquiries. So this is something that I feel like I, you know, observe, and I've like spoken about this with a couple friends who tend to agree, but I would love to, you know, at least see people maybe like discuss this a little bit more, and then consider it. Now that I'm not in academia anymore, so it's one of the rare opportunities where I get to meet other people. So, and I feel like one thing I'm sure of is that I do believe in collective power. So I definitely, this is my particular approach that I use in my book, but I also think, like, you know, one person's effort has limited impact. So, you know, I'm also here to kind of put this out on the table, and then I definitely think this has to be, for it to really work, has to be like a collective effort.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Donnie. Thank you, Wang. I think we can wrap up here. I think we might need a little break to you know, to think and prepare ourselves for the next session, 4 o'clock in GMT time, about classical antiquity. So please stay with us
Yes.
if you
I look
can.
forward to talk
From Shanghai.
by Denise and other colleagues. And
Yes.
I will, yeah. I will,
Excellent.
look forward
Thank
to
you.
listening
Thank you.
other
A
talks.
word of goodbye, Donny.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you
See
so
you.
much.
Thanks,
Thank you
Donny.
so much. So we see you in a little 15 minutes or so.
Yes.
You're back, yes. Professor Renton, are you with us?
Can you give us the precise time? Like
4 p.m. The precise time would be 4, let's say 35. Yes, can you confirm this for me? Hello?
so that's in like 37 minutes, right? Because I'm in a different time zone.
Yes, and
Hello,
and Professor
everybody.
Wang as well.
Sorry
Jen,
for
what time do
my
you
delayed
make?
arrival, Monica.
We need a GMT time, please.
Yes, sorry. So yeah, we shall be beginning at 1600 GMT. So that is in approximately 35 minutes. So that will give us time to digest ancient Mesopotamia after we have devoured it, thanks to Professor and Dr. Wang. And thank you once again also to Monica, our critical partner for this conference and so much more at the ICR, for leading this discussion. So many huge questions for us to begin thinking about. And thank you so much for everybody for contributing, and Dr. Wang contributing from Berlin, and Dr. Xianhua Wang, Professor Wang, our first keynote of our conference, who, by the way, just to point out to everybody, he is speaking from Shanghai. He's speaking, it's well past my bedtime. I think we're already, what is it, 11 p.m. with you in Shanghai?
Yeah. That doesn't matter. It's just I'm a little bit scared,
Well, look, thanks so much, everybody. All of our attendees and everything. Make yourselves a cup of tea, cup of coffee, or what have you, and we will reconvene in 35 minutes. So thanks so much, everyone.
I'll let Dr. Ben Gidley chair the next session. Thank you very much. Bye, Donny. Bye, Wang.
And see you in a bit.
Soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Stay tuned. Stay with us.
I will.
I'll be back.
name is Scott Harrison.
My name is not Scott Harrison. My name is James Renton, and I'm very happy to welcome everybody back to this conference. We had a wonderful panel chaired by Monica Gonzalez Correa, who I'm very happy to say is still with us.
Hello.
Editor of
Hello again.
Monitor Racism magazine. Our next panel, we're moving on to classical antiquity. After this fantastic initial keynote from Professor Wang. And now it's a good time for me to hand over to Dr. Ben Gidley.
Thank you, James. So it's 1 minute to 4. Shall I start at 4 o'clock, James? It's 1 minute to 4 in the UK. It's other times in other places. Well,
Can you all hear me just to test my microphone again?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'll unmute for a bit.
Is mine okay? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Brilliant. We're missing one panelist, Susan. Is that right? Who's due on second, I think.
Now, Susan is with us. I'll just be bringing her in just before her paper onto the panel, but Susan is with us as an attendee.
Okay, great.
So everybody is here.
Brilliant. Okay. So as soon as my clock says 4, I'll start. And welcome back, everybody, to the first panel session of this fantastic conference. As James just said, I'll be chairing this panel. My name is Ben Gidley. I'm a senior lecturer at Birkbeck, University of London. Not a classicist, I should say. And we have 3 fantastic speakers in this session who are, and will be speaking in the following order: Professor Denise McCoskey from Miami University, Ohio, USA, Professor Susan Lape from University of Southern California, and then Rebecca Futo Kennedy, Associate Professor at Denison University. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then after everyone's spoken, then we'll have about half an hour for discussion. As with previous sessions, if you use the Q&A for submitting questions, and we can get to your questions then. I'm not going to read out the extremely impressive biographies of 3 speakers because you have them in the program. It's suffice to say they've all extremely distinguished with some really amazing publications. So please read their biographies in the panel, in the program. So I'm now going to hand over to Denise McCoskey, and who will be sharing her screen for slides.
Great. Thank you very much. So I want to thank the conference organizers, especially James and Monica, and the sponsors for putting together such an important event and with such an impressive slate of contributors. This would definitely have been difficult to manage even in the best of times, never mind during such a complicated year and a global pandemic. And I really want to thank them for reaching out to the classical scholars and getting us involved, because for some reasons I'll talk about, we're not always part of such interdisciplinary conversations about race. So I'm both happy to be exposed to the work that all of you are doing more deeply, and also really happy to be just part of the conversation. In my talk today, and I think it actually follows really well from Professor Wang, I want to outline some of the ways that race as a concept has featured or conversely been silenced in study of the classical world. Generally speaking, as I will discuss, notions of racial purity and cultural achievement infused early classical studies, but classical scholars' engagement with race as a concept abruptly ended following the Second World War.
And in the decades following, and until very recently, the field has generally sought to avoid or suppress the term altogether, leading to a kind of pernicious amnesia that has not only distorted, I believe, our understanding of antiquity, but it's also kept the field of classics from doing the kind of self-scrutiny other fields have been progressively engaging in. After giving a general overview of the intersections of race and classical scholarship, so it's kind of a meta look at how classics has been studied, I want to say a little bit more about where we might find racial structures at work in antiquity. So not just to lament that we're not using it in classics, but also to show a few examples of places where I think could productively apply the word. But this will be illustrated, I think, much more deftly in the papers by Susan and Rebecca. And then I'll end with a few comments about the imperatives that I believe face classics today. And some of this, actually, Dr. Wang has already alluded to in her response. So I want to start by sharing my screen. Okay, so to begin, I want to explain the term classical antiquity in my title. And this is kind of important that we not take it for granted. And while the adjective ancient can be applied loosely to anything pre-modern, antiquity as a noun has tended to connote the ancient Mediterranean. And this is a space inhabited by an array of societies and cultures, including the Assyrians, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Scythians, the Ethiopians. This is just a map of the modern Mediterranean world, the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians. Despite such a diverse landscape, my talk nonetheless focuses mainly on how the ancient Greeks have been studied over the last approximately 2 centuries. And I focus on that given that the Greeks have played such an outsized role in shaping the Western sense of itself in terms of the past. So the elevated position accorded to classical antiquity in the West can be traced back in large part back to its Renaissance so-called rediscovery. But it was only during the modern 18th and 19th centuries that the methods and contours of classics as a professional academic enterprise became formalized. And this was a period that likewise saw the rise of modern scientific approaches to race, something I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot about over the next few days. And the convergence of these two phenomena would be profound. For early classical scholars, like other historians at the time, increasingly envisioned history itself in terms of writing the biographies of different races, and they treated historical change as the product of, and this is Martin Bernal's words, the triumphs of strong and vital peoples over weak and feeble ones. So that became the engine of writing history, some of the contemporary ideas about race. Openly citing the superiority of ancient Greece and Rome, early classical scholars readily drew on contemporary racialized notions like progress when accounting for ancient Greek society. So too, classical scholars were deeply influenced by writers like Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, whose work disseminated many of the tenets of scientific racism, including the notion that human races were biologically distinct and that any crossing of bloodlines would lead to inferiority, weakness, and even increased mortality. And you can see throughout classical scholarship of this period, assumptions about the role of racial purity, the connections of racial purity, so-called, to alleged cultural achievements, and also when it came to ancient Rome, the inverse, that is a linkage of so-called race mixing to Rome's decline. Even as scientific discourses, and especially those tied to biology and the body, were central to classical scholarship of the 18th and 19th century, contemporary race theorists, in turn, leaned on classical historians to confirm their views about the alleged superiority of certain races over time. So there was an important feedback loop that was going on between classical historians and contemporary race theory. It was during this era that J.C. Knott and G.R. Glidden, in their widely read Types of Mankind, notoriously placed the head of the statue of Apollo Belvedere atop a racial chart in illustration of the physique they associated with a Greek skull. Such a practice openly treated the idealized anatomy represented on Greek statuary, in this case, the representation of a literal Greek god, as historical record of so-called real Greeks and their supposedly superior Caucasian body type. Within such a climate, the longstanding affinity of classical culture in many Western nations had given way to more pointed claims about a shared racial heritage. And many European and American classical scholars not only professed deep admiration for the ancient Greeks and Romans, but they also positioned themselves among the Greeks and Romans' modern descendants, an effective bond between scholar and subject that all too often continues today, even as its racialized connotations have become more veiled. And indeed, one of the most striking things in recent years has been a similar dropping of the pretense of culture and Western civilization and the overt positioning of Western heritage as a racial, meaning white, lineage stretching back to the Greeks and Romans. And I'll return to that at the end. Within early classical scholarship itself, two major fields of study, philology, meaning the in-depth study of linguistic structure and language development, and archaeology, became driven by projects that revolved around race, and not least an attempt to demonstrate the racial origin of the ancient Greeks themselves. Ancient Greek had first been identified as an Indo-European language in the late 18th century after certain resemblances between Greek and Sanskrit, an ancient Indian language, were recognized. When, as Nell Irvin Painter observes, quote, the 19th century rage for races turned languages into peoples, end quote, the Indo-European language family became attached to a race, one called Aryan, a word taken from the Sanskrit Arya, meaning noble or spiritual. The geographic and so presumed racial origin of Indo-European, and really meaning Indo-Europeans, the people, became a major preoccupation. And although its arrival, so-called, in Greece was initially attributed to an invasion from Central Asia, 19th century scholars increasingly placed the putative homeland of Indo-Europeans and Indo-European in Northern Europe itself. An impulse for defining the classical world in relation to contemporary Europe rather than the ancient Mediterranean that would only increase over time. While language study had initially dominated classics, the discipline of classical archaeology was emerging a little bit later by the latter half of the 19th century. And like their counterparts in philology, classical archaeologists soon made identification of early racial groups a primary concern. Although in this case, they delineated racial groups according to material culture rather than language, things like pottery and architectural style, which we saw a little bit of with ancient Mesopotamia and Professor Wang's talk. Moreover, as Bronze Age sites, these earlier sites in Greek history, were increasingly excavated in the late 19th, early 20th century, many classical archaeologists openly proclaimed their disappointment in the material culture they were finding, and which they linked to groups they labeled the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Concluding that these early inhabitants of the Greek world were unfit ancestors for the glory that would become Greece, many classical scholars inserted into the timeline a so-called Dorian invasion from the north, and Dr. Wang mentioned that in her comments. One they used to explain wide-scale destruction in the historical record around 1050 BCE, but it was to this Dorian group, often explicitly associated with Northern Europe, or in the racial category of the era, the Nordic racial group, that later Greek culture would henceforth be credited. Debates about the role of racist ideologies in the founding in these early centuries of classical studies exploded in the 1980s following publication of volume 1 of Martin Bernal's Black Athena. Arguing that racism and Eurocentric bias had distorted the ways ancient evidence was used to reconstruct the roots and development of Greek civilization, Bernal specifically called out 18th and 19th century classical scholars for inventing what he called an Aryan model of Greek origin, one that sought to erase the influence of Egypt and the Near East on the development of Greek culture. And his thesis about ancient Egypt was especially widely publicized globally and featured in a Newsweek cover story that also talked about Afrocentrism. Under this question, was Cleopatra Black? In later volumes, Bernal made the case for his own revised ancient model, a model that asserted substantial Greek, this is his language, cultural borrowings from Egypt and the Levant between the years 2100 and 1100 BCE. Borrowings, however, proved to be something of a misnomer, and the actual top-down mechanism of cultural influence proposed by Bernal, namely that of a long period of domination by Egypto-Semitic conquerors, curiously aligned with the very 19th century models he was trying to topple. And so although his sociology of knowledge, I think, was really important and taken on board, some of his own model was actually quite problematic, especially in the way that it reproduced this idea of cultural change only involving violence and top-down conquest. And just for example, in passing, he also endorsed the historicity of the Dorian invasion. So he was really attached to some of these 19th century ideas, even as he was combating them in other ways. And while Bernal's work shed light, especially on the 18th and 19th century methods and classics, the influence of contemporary racial ideas on classical scholarship continued well into the 20th century. And I'm currently doing a project on what I consider to be the second generation of racial science, namely eugenics and the intersections of eugenics and classical scholarship in the early 20th century. But all of that kind of ends with the Second World War, and the dire consequences of concepts like race mixing would be laid bare by World War II. And like many academic disciplines, classics would radically alter its methods vis-a-vis race, eventually erasing the term altogether from its critical apparatus. And there were a range of reasons for this avoidance of race, and not least the controversy surrounding Black Athena itself, which left many classicists quite embittered and refusing to simply use the word race. But in addition, there was also a notable preference for the terminology of ethnicity, and this is something that Professor Wang talked about in terms of Mesopotamia, although I think that in classics, there were not open conversations about that. Classicists simply adhered to this very simplistic binary that they wanted to use ethnicity because ethnicity was ostensibly an identity that was claimed through social performance, whereas they believed that race was an identity passively dictated by one's biological makeup. And this was a binary that was being widely discredited in lots of other disciplines, but classicists really held on to that idea that race was biological and ethnicity could be social. But another reason for this avoidance of race was really the way that the field took on the work of Frank Snowden Jr., a prominent African-American classical scholar. And for decades, Snowden studied Greek and Roman attitudes towards the group he called Blacks in Antiquity, which was mainly to him ancient Ethiopians. His work was published most widely in the 1960s through the 1980s, and it was unquestionably radical for its time, especially in its argument that the ancient Greeks and Romans did not discriminate against people with Black skin. While he used such research to make powerful critiques of modern racism, and that's a really powerful part of his work, Snowden's conclusions nonetheless tended to be flattened into a single and misleading proposition, one that still prevails among many, if not most, classical scholars today, namely that there was no such thing as race in the ancient world. In rejecting the terminology of race, most classical scholars thus credited Snowden's work with having proven not that the Greeks and Romans did not follow modern ideas about race, but rather that race itself did not exist at all in antiquity. In this way, despite the advances being made since the 1990s by critical race theory, classical scholars continued for decades to treat skin color as a transhistorical signifier of racial identity rather than merely its modern guise. Moreover, Snowden's exclusive focus on Black bodies left Greek and Roman bodies completely uninterrogated, and the status of such bodies as white continued to go unchallenged. Given the recent work by historians in a range of fields, including many here today, it seems now perhaps unsurprising to find that the Greeks and Romans did not adhere to a biological model of race that was itself only developed in the modern 18th and 19th century. But rather than allowing Snowden's work to be the end of the story, I argued in my 2012 book that it was now necessary for classicists to pick up where Snowden had left off, meaning that if classical scholars accept that skin color did not provide the primary foundation for racial thought in antiquity, a conclusion we need to apply to both Black and white skin color, then the requisite follow-up question is surely to ask, in what ways and in under what historical pressures did different groups in antiquity form their ideas about race? And what consequences did those ideas and attendant practices have for themselves and those around them? So if they didn't adhere to modern ideas, what are their own ideas about race and the practices that accrued from those ideas? So one way that we might begin to kind of reorient our approach to race in antiquity is, of course, to think of how the Greeks and Romans viewed the world rather than the way we view it. And so if we look at, for example, their concept of the world that they lived in and the peoples that inhabit it, we see that the Greeks and Romans and ancient geographers in general relied heavily on the concept of the oikumene, which was this single island mass surrounded by water. And it's interesting that ancient Greeks and Romans recognized that there was life outside the oikumene, but for them, it was kind of an undifferentiated fantasy space. This is why the Amazons are constantly migrating in antiquity, because they constantly have to be put outside the oikumene, which was itself expanding under the Greeks and Romans. So one of the things that ancient thought did was it placed considerable weight on the identification of the oikoumeni's limits in each direction. And it gave special attention to the people thought to reside at the furthermost point of each. So for example, the Celts became associated with the extreme west, the Scythians with the north, Indians with the east, and Ethiopians with the south. And ancient writers would continue to treat these groups as emblematic of human life in each direction. And notably, there was a conflation of Ethiopia and India in ancient thought, suggesting that the geographic extremes of East and South often blurred in the ancient worldview. And that's why it's sometimes hard to pull apart some of these categories of people, because in that area, there's a kind of a distinct fluidity. It's interesting how it gets resolved. So in addition to their focus on what it meant to dwell in each part of the oikoumene, ancient philosophers and geographers also pondered other sources or explanations for human variation. At one point, the oikoumene was divided into a series of latitudinal bands or zones called climata. And in accordance with what is often called the ancient environmental theory, different racial characteristics and capacities were attributed to groups living in each zone. And there were different explanations for why that was, but it was thought that climate was determining them, and in many cases it was directly linked to the heat of the sun. This use of climata to explain human variation and to also give superiority to people ostensibly living in the middle band lasted well into the Renaissance. And the ancient environmental theory would go on to provide a key edifice for the organization of modern racial thought, surviving in both broad outline and via the Hippocratic essay, Airs, Waters, Places as well. Indeed, a summary of Airs, Waters, Places was found among Montesquieu's papers, and he presumably relied heavily on it for his seminal work on the spirit of the laws in 1748. By the 19th century, however, the theory of environmental determinism was losing ground to theories of race based on biological science, theories that correlated race with human physiognomy, so not the external environment so much, and especially skin color, and whose impact we've already seen on early classical studies. This biological model really intersected with the rise of classics. While geographic placement and climate provide important methods for explaining the source of racial difference in antiquity, there were nonetheless conflicting views about the putative source of human variation. So this was far from the only way of thinking about racial difference. And one of the central debates was the degree to which fundamental human differences were based in what we might call essence, meaning the environment or someone's bloodline, versus practice, the language one spoke or the gods one worshipped. Although both views persisted in one form or another, as Jonathan Hall has argued, the use of cultural performance nonetheless seems to have become more prominent over time in defining racial identity. In this way, alongside what we might consider scientific theories or scientific ways of explaining racial difference, other more social and contrasting racial ideas and practices were mobilized within specific contexts and in response to specific historical circumstances. For example, I'm just going to give a few here. Scholars like Edith Hall and Jonathan Hall have argued that the Greeks' conception of themselves as Greeks emerged only at a very specific point in time, that is, in the shadow of the Persian Wars, a time when the previously independent Greek city-states, as we call them, joined together often tenuously to repel two separate invasions by the massive Persian Empire. Even more, the racial contours of this new collective Greek identity were largely articulated against its presumed opposite, the barbarian, a concept that was initially applied to the Persians, as you see in this art, but it soon connoted all outsiders or non-Greeks. And the idea of the barbarian served an important role within Greek society as well, reinforcing the Greek practice of chattel slavery, meaning the subjugation of peoples who, when they were labeled barbarians, could be cast as fundamentally different, and as expressed in the writings of Aristotle, slaves by their very nature. We can also pinpoint then other versions of what Omi and Winant have called racial formations in antiquity. And just to give another example, we could look to the powerful city-state of Athens during its heyday in the 5th century, a time when, as Susan has argued in her important book, Race and Citizen Identity in the Classical Athenian Democracy, a racialized form of citizenship was progressively enacted. And I think both Susan and Rebecca are going to do a much deeper dive into some of this material. And there are many other examples of ancient modes of thought and practice that can be productively analyzed, I believe, through this lens of race, including the ideologies and racial dynamics that attended the formation of Rome's vast multicultural empire. So there's all sorts of ways we need to think about applying this term to the Roman world, as well. But if race is necessary for better comprehending the ancient world on its own terms, I would like to conclude by underlining how necessary it is for classicists to engage with race in order to confront the modern world and its continuing appropriations of antiquity. For there is still a very active trade between the work of classical historians and contemporary racial and even racist narratives. Well, the events at Charlottesville in 2017 had an enormous impact on the American psyche. For classicists in particular, it should be impossible after Charlottesville to ignore the fact that even as white nationalist groups are becoming increasingly visible, their reliance on classical texts and iconography are now in open view. Even more, in many cases, they are relying openly on the work of 18th and 19th century classical scholarship itself. So the field has a lot of reckoning to do with its own past as it moves forward. And in the current climate, classicists must undo some of the Greeks and Romans they have created by repeatedly and forcefully countering the most damaging narrative, which is that the Greeks and Romans were themselves white. And there's an empirical question about skin color, which is one question, but classicists really need to undo the very idea of skin color. They eagerly embrace the meaning that Black skin was meaningless in antiquity. They have to undo the whiteness of antiquity as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Denise, for a really rich paper, which I think set up our session really nicely. And I think there's some issues which we're going to continue to thread throughout this whole, the whole of our 3 days. So just to remind people, we're going to have all 3 speakers now and then discussion. So start to think about your questions, which you can later post in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Our second speaker.
About this, however, is that my way of understanding race and my discussions of race, as well as the other model, which my friend Jackie Murray at the University of Kentucky has developed, come from deep involvement and engagement with the very vast scholarship from others outside of the discipline and outside of history on race. So, you know, the decades of scholarship on critical race theory, we even can, go back to W.E.B. Du Bois and Antiquity. The idea being that we have to be in dialogue with modern theories. We can't simply propagate modern models from the ancient world that will be useful necessarily or be active contributions to understanding race unless we understand the development of the history of race as Denise and others in our field are working on today. So I just want to situate what I'm doing. What I am actually proposing is a model or a way of thinking about race by doing an analysis of the Athenian metic. And I will explain what that is because I recognize that a large number of people in the audience may not actually know what that is. It's sort of a niche aspect of ancient Athenian and Greek history. And I will explain what that is, but I'm sort of doing an analysis of this group that existed within the Athenian political and legal system as a way to think about how we can understand race better today as well. What I'm also presenting is building off of a book that I wrote in 2014 called Immigrant Women in Athens, which was an intersectional study of women who formed a part of this group and how they fell into special legal classes and categories. So I'll start by offering an explanation for what is a metic. The term is typically defined as either a resident foreigner or an immigrant, but we want to make sure that we recognize that these would be permanent immigrants. There is no pathway to citizenship for a person in this category within the city of Athens. The defining characteristic of them is that they were, if you lived for longer in a month in the city or you intended to stay for longer in a month or so in the city, that you had to register yourself as a in this thing called metoikia. And so you registered with one of the local administrators and you had to pay a special tax. this was everyone included in this category. There was no distinction between whether you were a Greek or whether you were a Scythian or whether you were a Thracian or whether you were Persian, whether you were a refugee, whether you were a freed slave, formerly enslaved person. Anyone who was not a citizen would have to register in this category. Even at one point, we will have the illegitimate children of a citizen man would have to be part of the city. And at every time, the illegitimate child of a citizen woman would enter into this population. So it is a very diverse population that is basically stuck in a category from which there is no release. Only male medics who had done extraordinary service to the city of Athens could be released from them. Even their own wives were given only what we would call temporary or passive citizenship, in that they could give birth to citizens, but they themselves, if their spouse died, they lost their status as citizens. So it was only a quasi-citizenship. That's one of the sort of things that we need to understand, that this is a very diverse category that in other schemes might be categorized different. It cuts across race, it cuts across ethnicities, economic status, social status, and gender. Here are some of the laws that we know of that in the initial phases of the creation of this category that defined the category. This is not a social category, it is a legal category that brings it to its social weight, and it is a legal category constructed specifically within a political context of the Athenian democracy. It has been thought in the past that this category was crafted along with the creation of the Athenian democracy around 510, 11 BCE. But the most recent scholarship by many of us, there's a sort of a larger group of us more and more coming to this conclusion that the status of medic wasn't created until around the 470s or 460s. So it's probably sometime in a period of about 40 years after the creation of the citizen as a category. I list here, as I noted, some of the primary characteristics. These will be refined and changed over time, not necessarily done away with, but added to. So you'll get more restrictions added onto what it means to be a medic in Athens, not less. So that basically is the topic, the group of people that I want to discuss today. And I want to discuss them through a lens of race. And I'm going to make a point here of sharing my definitions with you, because one of the things is that we have to deal with in ancient history is that scholars have used race with different meanings when discussing the ancient Greek world. And it is a concept given to a frustrating multivalence. So I feel it's important for me to clarify what I do mean and do not mean by race, as well as explain the technical meaning that I'm going to be using here today. I have created this definition and adapted it primarily for today's discussion from the works of the political philosopher Falguni Sheth and the historian and sociologist Karen and Barbara Fields. Their own definitions are rooted in long histories of critical race theory, as I noted before. And so I want us to recognize that this is a dialogue that we should be in. Now, race as I use it here today is a technology or doctrine of population management that institutionalizes ethnic prejudice, oppression, and inequality based on imaginary and moving signifiers for human difference, signifiers that may manifest differently in different times and places. So the idea is that race is a transhistorical and fluid concept. If there is a person, I think, working today who is closest to this conceptualization, who uses a similar framing, it would be Geraldine Heng, though we do differ in some ways. Now, these imaginary and moving signifiers in the case of the Athenian and the medic will eventually follow what Fields and Fields define as, quote, the doctrine that nature produced humankind in distinct groups defined by inborn traits that its members share and that differentiate them from the members of other distinct groups. Because these groups are imaginary, they can be constituted from those who might, in a different classification system, be very, very diverse. Now, race then is a doctrine or technology for creating distinctions in institutions. In our Athenian case, I'm going to focus on laws that craft political institutions that create and then support a doctrine of inherent superiority of the citizen population while casting everybody else as inferior. In this framework, we might then define racism as, and I have Fields and Fields definition here, I think, which is the most apt here, as, quote, the practice of applying a social, civic, or legal double standard. For Athenians, that double standard inheres in the application of law, and particularly in the right to enslave between citizens and medics, and the right to torture. Racism is the application of law to enforce distinctions between political classes and their risk of experiencing state-moderated violence. The distinctions between Athenians and medics that are then reproduced are what we would call racecraft, which again, Fields and Fields define as, quote, the practical day-to-day actions that reproduce the imaginary pervasive belief in natural distinctions between these groups. Some examples of racecraft would be the daily reminders of second-class status, like having to pay special taxes. A medic would have to, of course, pay a personal tax to simply reside in the city, which we call the metoikion. They would have to pay foreigners-only taxes for using the port or for selling their goods in the markets. There were limitations on how they could enforce contracts, and they, of course, couldn't own property or buildings, and they were banned from certain civic spaces and segregated when participating in city rituals. Civic rituals, and what we might consider today religious activities. Now, how does race form? So here is my model that I am using to think about how race actually develops. So if we're thinking about race as a technology and not content, right, the content can change over time and the content can be different. So what we would consider something like the color line today is not really applicable to the ancient world. Instead, we have a very different way of thinking about how race will constitute in specific places and times. So race forms and reproduces, I suggest, through a process that begins with defining a political community. This community then must recognize internal threats, which Sheth refers to as the unruly, which sort of gives away her own philosophical descent. This recognition instigates what she refers to as the taming of the unruly through the imposition or refining of laws that have a threat of violence as their mechanism of enforcement. These laws create distinctive racial categories into which the community is then sorted. Next, the racial divisions are naturalized or justified within the community, frequently through narratives of biological sameness or purity, but not always. This gives rise to race. The system is then reproduced through the enframing of vulnerability and violence as a defining characteristic of the group's place within that community. This is racecraft. Now, this understanding of race is different from what we might consider folk ideas of race in a modern context, what has been called somatic or epidermal race or bio-race. This modern folk definition appears within my framework only as a signifier of difference, but one that is historically contingent. It may not mean in one context the same as it means in another. For example, as we note, the specific modern signifier of skin color, which is often used as a shorthand to change racism into race in the modern US, is not relevant as a component of race, racism, or racecraft in Greco-Roman antiquity. Any biological fiction used as shorthand for race is created in part of the process, and it is just that, a shorthand, but not actually race itself. So by focusing on the process and technology of race, we can retain the term ethnicity as a productive and meaningful one in discussing antiquity. When I use the term ethnicity or ethnic in discussions, I'm referring primarily to self or other defined groups based on ideas of shared culture, language, or political affiliation that are not embedded. So we have to unembed them from legally enforceable hierarchies of oppression. And I give two examples here of images, and I will explain what these two images are. So the first is a tomb of Demetria of Kyzikos. This is a tomb for a Medic woman in Athens that is created by her own family, most likely. In this way, we see that she retains the ethnic. She is not from Athens. She is from the city of Kyzikos, which is near the Black Sea. And so here we have a self-identification. We actually refer to these uses of a polis or a city or a region on a tombstone by someone as an ethnica. It's their ethnic identifier. The second tomb, however, is by a Medic woman as well, but she is probably a freed enslaved woman. Her tomb is probably put up by the family she worked for. She is a nurse. Her name is Melita. She is listed as the daughter of Apollodorus, who is called an isoteles. Isoteles is a special status category for a Medic in Athens, which gives them tax equality with Athenian citizens. So she's being identified by Athenians through her relationship to the caste system that she belongs to. She is not given an ethnic as it were. So in order for race to exist, as most scholars in critical race theory suggest, it has to exist within a political order of some sort, not simply as an abstract category. Without the creation of hierarchies and the ability to enforce oppressions, we have prejudice or ethnocentrism. It's the power of a state or of institutions to enforce socio-political otherness that I would suggest determines whether we have race in an ancient context or not, or a modern context even. Ancient Athens eventually uses the myth of indigeneity, autochthony, linked to biological descent as their justification for the segregation of their population, but it's the institutionalized threat of violence for enforcing a form of segregation or caste that makes the case for the Metic as a type of race. Now, for Athenians, the Metic was perhaps the most salient other in their daily lives, insofar as they had another free population against which to rank themselves. We often distinguish populations by free versus enslaved, but there's this other middle ground in the population that is a free population that allows the Athenians to elevate themselves above not just enslaved persons who they have sort of alienated from humanity, but those who considered are still within a range of humanity, as it were. It is certainly a more operational identity than the barbarian in a direct Athenian context, and it cuts across and dismantles on a regular basis the notion of a unified Greek identity, which many scholars have depended upon for understanding race or ethnicity in the ancient world. And I would recommend Dimitra Kasimis, which I list in my last slide, has a discussion of this aspect of the Metic and political theory in Plato in the 4th century for anyone interested. So how did the Metic and so the Athenian become racialized? It's my contention actually that the Athenian is only racialized as a result of the process that created the Metic. You cannot create an upper caste without a lower caste to actually create yourself through. We see the following historical steps. First, we have the creation of the Athenian demos through patrilineal citizenship. Next, the creation of the Metic as a legal category. This is then followed by dual descent citizenship in 451, and finally the elevation of the myth of the autochthonous ancestor to a full myth of Athenian indigeneity and ethnic purity. Later laws, like the requirement for deme registration, reinstatement of the citizenship law in 403, and bans on marriage are refinements and reassertions of the system. In the second step, we see the construction of in the first step, we see the construction of political community, which is the first step for our model. The second is the identification, this creation of the Metic class as the identification of the unruly, the group within the community identified as a threat to the political order. And this is then going to be followed by the group's segregation in an attempt to reduce potential harm to the political order. The physical and even cultural sameness of the Metic, I would argue, is actually the thing that makes them dangerous and what makes them bothersome and troubling to the Athenian. There's only a subtle sense of difference that they can sense, but it's not easily identified. Perhaps the original unease is simply that these are groups of people who live here all the time who are not citizens. We don't know how large the population is, and we can't actually get back to necessarily the original reasons for the creation of this category. Whatever it was, in consciously creating and defining through legal restrictions a category beyond not citizen and designating certain individuals within the community as members of it, the Athenians succeeded in also re-emphasizing their own identity as citizens and the political order upon which their own status rested. They continued to shift the laws over time to adjust policy as prejudice was naturalized. And this is, in fact, the next phase of the process of racialization, which is the taming of, after the taming of the unruly, which is the naturalization of distinctions, so that the mechanisms that went into crafting those categories disappear and get hidden within the system itself, so that they can be reproduced without having to re-justify it every time. Now, the original definition of the Metic rested on a patriarchal justification. The citizenship law focused on a more purely biological or double descent justification. The shift in policy and in definition of the legal category crafted the underlying framework for the racializing of Athens through these Metics. I think, in fact, when they talk about the reasons for the citizenship law being passed, Aristotle and Plutarch, after the fact, at least 1 to 2 centuries for 1.5 centuries for Aristotle and 7 centuries for Plutarch, say that there were quote unquote too many citizens. And I just don't find that a satisfactory reason for putting this in place. I think, in fact, the important element in the decision to craft this refinement to make double descent, or a more pure biological descent, the reason for exclusion has to do with an upswing in prejudice that actually resulted from the crafting of the category of medic. Once you set a piece of the population aside, you are saying there's something inherently different about them. This prejudice then builds up so that over the course of the next 2 decades, they then come to justify even further. So racist ideas and racist policy precede the construction of race and its naturalization. The increase in prejudice leads to the development of a concept of indigeneity, which then functions as the naturalizing retroactive justification for the medic's exclusion. Now, although laws initially segregated medics, the idea of Athenian autochthony naturalized the category of the citizen, grounding the fiction that the law simply reinforced a division made in nature. The naturalization process appears reasonable and rational when we recognize that indigeneity in Athens was a type of environmental determinism, a broadly held idea that the geography, topography, and climate of places shaped and defined the peoples who resided there, which Denise mentioned in her own talk. And which one of our speakers tomorrow, Dr. Wida, will be speaking about, and which she actually contributed a chapter on to a volume I edited. So really excited to hear her talk on this topic in the medieval world. Now, the Athenians, indigenous to their land and imbued with certain characteristics from the land, came to identify themselves with a closed kinship group that invested in an idea of real or pure. Autochthony myths, the metaphorical manifestation of this doctrine, a racial doctrine, as my co-presenter Susan Leip has argued in her wonderful book, demonstrated the superiority of Athenians to themselves. It's only later, though, however, that we're going to get a ban on marriage. And this is sort of where a lot of my work has situated in understanding how women themselves acted within this group as a special demarcated group that caused special anxiety for the Athenians. But I'm not going to go into the details on that. I'm happy to answer questions about how gender definitively intersects with this problem. Now, during the course of the Peloponnesian War, these laws on double descent were relaxed. Maybe even repealed. We're not exactly sure, but it seems to be fairly clear to most scholars now that they were not enforced. In 403, however, the laws requiring that Athenian citizens have 2 Athenian parents and restrict their land ownership to only Athenian citizens was reinstated as part of the foundation of the newly revived democracy that had been dismantled briefly by a reactionary oligarchy known as the 30 at the end of the Peloponnesian War. In the aftermath of this reinstatement of the laws, the demarcation between medic and citizen actually becomes increasingly harsh. It will eventually lead to the marriage ban, suggesting that prejudices that inhered in the status of medic earlier had acquired that required their segregation did not disappear even under the extreme circumstances of war. Relaxing the laws and allowing medics and even enslaved persons access to citizenship was partially, we see in some sources, blamed for the reason why the Athenians lost the war. Once the medic had been racialized and this racialization naturalized, they would always be deemed inherently threatening. The medic population in the 4th century was increasingly made up of formerly enslaved persons may also have increasingly contributed to this prejudice. Now, because of the variety of persons and origins and statuses that made up the medic class, and although medics were defined as a single class by law, the laws were not experienced equally by all medics. While scholarship on medics has done a good job of recognizing class distinctions among them and acknowledging privileges offered to medics, rarely did those privileges accrue to anyone who was a working class medic or who was part of the freed enslaved persons population. We talk about often these issues of we erase the issues of gender, we erase the issues of class. And I want to make sure that we constantly understand that because these laws are only undermined, and because race itself in its systematic institutional form is often underlined by threats of violence, we have to recognize that populations will experience that differently. So here we're getting to my last slide. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of race and violence and how violence underscores and actually is one of the principal founding elements of a race system. So by 403 BCE, the legal structures were in place for the perpetuation and reproduction of race in Athens through the medic. In other words, the process of racializing the medic and therefore the Athenian had been mostly completed. The reproduction of race, which may be understood through the racecraft of everyday life, happened in many ways, but often through violence or the threat of violence. To be a medic was to be vulnerable to such violence. The penalties, if you abrogated your status as a medic, were enslavement, execution, or torture in the course of a discussion, or in the course of a legal dispute. So if you violated any of your status categories, if you pretended to be a citizen, you could be executed. If you didn't register, didn't pay your fees, you could be sold into enslavement, and there were actually incentives for citizens to turn you in. So this is a very important thing for us to think about in terms of what it meant to be a medic. You were closer to the slave than you were to the free citizen, or even a visiting foreigner. So, and here I want us to think about how my colleague Jackie Murray conceptualizes this idea of race in Athens. And actually, she's working on it in a much broader space. So what I would argue is that medics received what we would call alienable humanity, according to Jackie's usage of the word. In her discussion of Homer's Odyssey, Murray places race and ethnicity on a continuum, with ethnic others granted a higher level of humanity, while racialized groups who are further away from the inalienable humanity of the dominant group are granted less humanity. Thus, in our Athenian context, a Milesian visitor or business partner was closer to Athenian to the extent that they still functioned as their ethnic self. But once they became medics, their racialized status meant that they were subject to Athenian institutional violence in ways that other foreigners who were simply visiting were not. Medics could not appeal to shared Ionian or Greek identities, or even to being from an Athenian colony if they wanted to mitigate their status as a medic. Such distinctions were erased once they became a medic in law, and the Olynthian was no different from the Thracian or the Scythian or any other barbarian in their status and their being subject to state violence. Obviously, not all medics, and in fact, the majority, would never have experienced the violence of being sold into enslavement or being executed or even tortured. We don't really have a lot of evidence we have more evidence for attempts to sell into slavery than we do of torture. However, want to recognize that this is one of the fundamental aspects of race. It isn't the experience of violence being necessary, only the threat, which is validated by the fact that others within the group do experience this violence as part of their everyday existence and within the scope of the law. The threat is what allows for those medics with privileges to have them and to feel their privileges and even argue against the interests of their class as a whole in order to maintain them. Wealthy medics and those who arrived in Athens as refugees were often granted a series of privileges within the scope of law that could mitigate their vulnerability to violence. Some refugee groups were even given one-time grants of potential citizenship. For some medics, living in Athens approached citizen status, but without assembly attendance and voting. They performed liturgies, they dined with, and in the 5th century still intermarried with their social peers. They participated in the Panathenaic procession. And the reward system of privileges, like grants of tax equality or the ability to own property or buildings, rewarded those medics who not only followed the rules, but who were deemed most useful to the polis. They became in some ways what we would call model minorities, whose privileging could encourage them to become complicit in the enforcement of violence or on others within the group.
Rebecca, can I ask you to move to a...
Yes, I am concluding right now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yes. Sorry, I got a little slow start because of the PowerPoint issue. Yeah, I want to refer here to give you an idea, just a single example of what we would think about the perpetuation of this violence. We have a series of inscriptions known as the Fialae inscriptions with over 400 extant names of people who are most likely had been charged with not paying their tax. And then they were, they made these dedications when they were freed from this. But these are hundreds of cases over the course of a series of decades of citizens turning their fellow residents in to be enslaved. And we don't even know how they were saved or why. But I do want to end with a single quotation of what I think is happening in Athens. And my hope is that this analysis will give us an idea of what to think about for about modern conceptions of race as well. This is from Falguni Chef. She says, and so we see through any number of legal judgments, race is never merely about race, but it is in the drawing of lines between evil beings and moral beings, between persons and non-persons, between humans being beings qua citizen and those who cannot be citizens because they are not human like us, where we find the salience of race. Understood as a vehicle by which to draw and redraw the boundaries by which select populations are assured the protection of the law, race becomes deployed as a technology. It is when we understand it as a technology that we begin to understand how race locates and domesticates the unruly, and so reveals the apparatus by which the normative ground of racial classification was once naturalized and then subsequently concealed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a really rich and fascinating paper. We've got now a couple of questions in the Q&A, and what I'm going to do for these is read them out. They're questions, I think, for the panel as a whole. Let's collect a few, maybe. So, Lindsay Kaplan says, thanks to all the presenters for great papers. I'm curious why no one engages with Benjamin Isaac's invention of racism in classical antiquity. Would any of the presenters consider their work in relation to his definition and discussion of classical racism? And Charles Schmidt says, I'm really curious about these rare cases where metics were offered this one-time offer of Athenian citizenship. Why were these offers available and who received these rare opportunities? Thanks for your presentation.
Hello, this is a message for our viewers on the YouTube channel of Monitor Racism magazine. The conference will be continuing again tomorrow at 1400 GMT. The keynote lecture with Professor Geraldine Heng will be exclusively broadcast this evening to participants at the conference. But we'll be coming back to the broadcast of the event tomorrow with medieval Europe and the medieval Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.